Hello and welcome to the Cities at Tufts Colloquium, along with our partners Shareable and the Kresge Foundation, and more recently the Barr Foundation. I'm Professor Julian Adjeman, and together with our research assistants, Perry Scheinbaum and Caitlin McLennan, we organise Cities at Tufts as a cross-disciplinary academic initiative which recognised Tufts University as a leader in urban studies, urban planning and sustainability issues. We'd like to acknowledge that Tufts University's Medford campus is located on colonised Wampanoag and Massachusetts territory. Today, we are delighted to welcome Isabelle Anguelovski and James Connolly. Isabelle is the director of BCNUEJ, the Barcelona Laboratory for Urban Environmental Justice and Sustainability, professor at ICREA, the Catalan Institute for Research and Advanced Studies, principal investigator at ICTA, the Institute of Environmental Science and Technology of the Autonomous University of Barcelona, and coordinator of the Research Group on Healthy Cities and Environmental Justice at IMIM, the Institute Hospital of the Del Mar de Investigación Médique. Why so many acronyms and so many jobs, Isabelle? We'll talk about that offline. James is co-director of BCNUEJ, and he's a BCNUEJ affiliated researcher and assistant professor of community and regional planning at the University of British Columbia in Vancouver. Isabelle and James's talk today is, in effect, a book launch for their forthcoming book, The Green City and Social Injustice, Tales from North America and Europe, which is in my Routledge book series, Equity, Justice and the Sustainable City. I do have to say at the start, Isabelle is speaking from Barcelona. There is a storm and her internet connection is a little bit iffy. So James has valiantly said that if something happens, he will step into the fray. Thank you, James. Isabelle, James, a Zoom-tastic welcome to the Cities at Tufts Colloquium. As usual, microphones and video off, and please send questions through the chat function. Isabelle, James.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here. It's always wonderful to come back to the Tufts and to the Boston community. So James and I have prepared some slides. I will turn off my video because of the issue that Julian was mentioning, but I think that James and I work. Does it work? But James and I work closely together, so we can always back up one another. All right. So we wanted to take advantage of the talk today, and thank you, Julian, again for your wonderful support and always very warm welcome through the years, to present a book, which is basically a collective endeavor, a very large international endeavor, where we together as a group of 35 authors doing research in 21 cities. We've done research in more cities, but they are not included here. Actually, would like to present our work on the green city and social injustice. We've conducted a total of 500 interviews for this book, and we have then divided up in a series of tales. The purpose of the book was to have a historic and a story-like narrative of our analysis, and also to be able to present and hopefully share the book as a teaching tool, as case studies that can be taught across undergraduate and graduate studies. Next. And the book really for us reflects the broader research that we do at our lab. And so our lab, the BCNUEJ Lab, was born just 5 years ago, almost exactly 5 years ago this fall. And we are a group of 20 researchers across the social and public health sciences. We bring together research, as in this book, on environmental and climate gentrification, alternative models for growth and degrowth, financialization and housing, as well as health. And we try to do that across a variety of settings. Next. Including in North America and Europe, which is the focus of this book. And so the broader question that drove us to write this book, to put this book together, were the two following ones. How can planning move away from urban greening being embedded in politics of unequal redevelopment, competitive urbanism, and land speculation, And how can green cities be truly just and emancipatory for all, rather than being a driver of new social and racial injustices? Next. If we think a bit about the broader theoretical views that inform our work, there is first the one that has to do with the legacy of unequal access to green space in cities, which is coming together with the legacy of environmental racism and housing discrimination. And so we come at this book with the recognition that, historically speaking, cities in North America and Europe have a variety of neighborhoods that have suffered from this legacy. Next. And James, you can just scroll quickly through the next slides. We see that in our case of Barcelona, for example, where places that might have had new parks like La Trinidad, those parks are surrounded by highway complexes and air pollution. This is also the case in a place like New Orleans, where historically, actually, the presence of green space was replaced by highway corridors, crossing and tearing Black neighborhoods apart. It's also coming up in other places that inform the book. Next. So that's the first, let's say, legacy and environmental injustice we are working with. However, what we also recognize is that green planning is now at a green paradox moment, as James has written about also before the book, because of how environmental privilege and urban growth are codependent. And so in globalizing cities, in all the cities that we have in the book, we see this paradox being exercised in different ways, which means that despite the needs that exist for urban greening and the multiple go benefits that derive from urban greening, we see green infrastructure recreating green Lulus in racially mixed and working class neighborhoods. Next. And so this brings us to one of the core focus of the book, and we are not the only one writing on this, which is environmental gentrification, right? Which is this entire environmental planning agenda related to public green spaces that is combined with the displacement or exclusion of economically vulnerable population under this very strong environmental branding and ethics, saying that green is good for everyone, as Hilary Angelo also writes about. Next. And of course, green gentrification is also embedded in other dimensions of this relationship between urban ecology and gentrification, such as in cases of green climate gentrification, which we have also written about. And how is that manifested? It's manifested in the fact that working class and racialized minorities are the groups more likely to experience residential and social displacement from both green climate infrastructure and its associated gentrification risks. Next. And so in this context of green gentrification, what we also think that we push forward in the book is how urban greening is embedded into processes of green branding and urban growth. We have seen in previous research, which we are just very briefly bringing in the book, that high levels of urban green boosterism, meaning this deep green image, this green identity that many globalizing cities are articulating now, are selling. All these levels of green boosterism are associated with high levels of unaffordability. As you can see here in the case of Vancouver, this is one of the most livable cities in the world. And what we also see is that it's one of the most unaffordable cities in the world. And so in that sense, this boosterism, this green boosterism is intertwined with urban rivalization that leads to less affordability and at the same time, unleashed access to urban greening. Next. And then moving again one level deeper, one of the logics that we have been focusing on in the book, and that another article that my colleague Melissa Garcia-Lamarca is focusing on in more specific ways, is the green grabbing logic. And the green grabbing logic is exercised by real estate developers, real estate agents around them, together with banks and investors, to capitalize on greening and appropriate the value of greening, and at the same time extract rent from greening, both from the land value that comes up, or the land value increase that comes up with the greening purpose, at the same time as with the consumer and investor demand that drives and is driven by greening. Under, again, these forms of grabbing that also have to do with discourse, articulation, and social grabbing, because developers and real estate investors around them have a deep ability now to show how greening is also an aspiration for them, an aspiration for their sector, and also articulate a discourse of social contribution, even though this social contribution is only for a few. Next. And then one of the other theoretical lenses that we try to push forward in the book is the racialization of greening. We have a series of neighborhoods that have a high number of racialized residents, immigrants from the global south in both the US and Europe. And so what we see is that there's an increasing white supremacy in greening as green gentrification illustrates different forms of displacement, physical, financial, and social cultural. And so greening ends up being a practice, a social spatial practice of white supremacy, which includes land grabbing, as I showed earlier in the previous slide, and also the exclusion and coercion of non-white practices in green space. And so a series of chapters that James will briefly talk about afterwards illustrate this dynamic. Next. And that's your turn, James.
Thank you. I just wanted to say it's a pleasure to be here with you all today to discuss this work a little bit. As Isabelle said, this book involves 35 authors and 22 different case studies in 22 different cities across Europe and North America, meaning there's a lot to organize. And I wanted to say a bit about how we organize it, but also make a note that all of these cases do always come back together around this nexus of urban greening and social justice. And that definitely unites the cases. And we worked hard to make sure that that thread works strongly throughout all of the cases. However, that manifests in different ways. That nexus manifests in different ways in different cases. And so we organize these different ways into 5 parts within the book. Each of these parts speaks in different ways to the conceptual frame that Isabelle just described. So the first part of the book is a set of cases that might be very familiar to people who are thinking about green gentrification. And this part is called the social costs of glitzy green urbanism. The cities in this section include Milan, Valencia, Amsterdam, and Bristol. And this is a section that speaks to what you might call the highline effect of urban greening, you know, the very sort of glitzy, high profile greening cases that bring that kind of cachet to cities and thus have social equity implications. So just to give you a sense of some of the types of greening that we're looking at in these cases, you can see these big vertical walls, things of that nature, greenways, big, large sort of implementations in cities. In the second section of the book, we are shifting a bit to cases that are looking less at the kind of glitzy aspect of greening and more at what we call the compounded risks and impacts of urban greening in post-industrial environments. So here it's really more about as environments are shifting away from these kinds of heavy industry post-industrial into a post-industrial identity, what role does greening play in reorganizing risk within those cities? So the cities we look at in this section include Dallas, Glasgow, San Francisco, Seattle, and Cleveland. And I'll speak in a moment just a bit more about San Francisco to give you a better sense of particularly what kinds of arguments come out in this section. Just to give you a sense of the types of environments that we're talking about in these cities, it's former brownfields that have been transformed and are then entered into the process of redevelopment in these cities. In the third sort of section of the book, in the third part of the book that speaks to another strand of ways that social justice forms a nexus with urban greening, we look at Washington, D.C., Atlanta, Austin, Texas, and Boston as one group. And we call this group of cities that are recreating unjust racialized landscapes in the green city. So in these cities, particularly, the question of how racialized landscapes get reinterpreted through urban greening is really central. And that's becomes the main thread that really comes to the surface in this section of the book. If there's time, we'll talk, maybe perhaps in questions, we can specifically talk about Washington, D.C., Austin, and Boston, which Isabelle and I have done particular research in. So just to give you a sense of, of these types of environments, these are environments where formerly highly racialized neighborhoods have seen new greening interventions as a kind of spearhead into a gentrification process. In the fourth part of the book, we're looking here at a group of cities that does what we call that performs what we call a complex entanglement of greening and multiple other gentrification pressures. So these are cities where green gentrification is definitely present, but it's a little bit more mixed up with other broader pressures for gentrification. So it's a little bit less obviously linked or hooked onto the greening piece, but the greening plays a part of the conversation in these cities, and an important part, but it's always mixed up with these other forces that are driving gentrification in the cities. And so we're looking here at Dublin, Montreal, Philadelphia, and Barcelona as examples of this. Barcelona, for example, has very strong tourism pressures and other things that are happening that are really driving changes in the city. And this group of cities are really characterized by this fact. And then finally, in the fifth group of cities, these cities form what we call the fragile green justice victories and gray zones in the just green city. So we're trying here to shift a bit toward what are some of the hopeful directions that we're seeing in cities? What are some cities that are definitely speaking to the nexus of social justice and urban greening, but maybe speaking to it in a way that gives us a little bit of a sense of how some of the injustices can be addressed through greening. And so here we're looking at Copenhagen, Nantes, Vienna, and Portland. It's important to say that these cities are not just about addressing injustices, but we can find cases and examples in these cities of that happening. So we have different kinds of greening initiatives happening in these cities, and they come at this question in different ways. But we thought it very important in this book to also address the fact that greening is not just about driving injustice, but there are ways of thinking about greening as a driver of social justice as well. So those are the 5 sections of the book. And pardon me. And what we wanted to do now is just give you a slight taste of what some of these chapters include in a bit more detail, but in a very brief way. So we're not going to give like the full case study, just a bit of a sense of what 2 of these chapters include, based upon work that Isabelle and I personally did for the book. And then conclude the talk with how we wrap the book up, and then open it up for questions from you all. So I'll talk a bit about the San Francisco case that we present in the book, and then I'll turn it over to Isabelle to talk a bit about Dublin. And if anyone wants to, in the discussion, raise other cities that we would like to discuss, we'd be happy to do so as well. The title of the San Francisco chapter, it's chapter 8 in the book, and it's from section 2. So section 2 talks about the ways that compounded risks are reorganized by new greening interventions in the city. And here we're looking at a particular neighborhood in San Francisco, which is the Bayview Hunters Point neighborhood. And this is a neighborhood that is probably makes the most sense for this section because it is formerly a very heavy industry area of San Francisco. We entitled this chapter, "A Community Fights for Its Health While Battling Impending Gentrification, Bayview Hunters Point, San Francisco." So to give you a sense, Bayview Hunters Point is this part of San Francisco that's the closest to us in the picture right now. You can still see in this picture the old Candlestick Park, and that's a former baseball stadium, which has been torn down in recent years. But that's where Bayview Hunters Point is. It's right out in that section of San Francisco. But it's also where we have a former Navy shipyard. We have a lot of very, very heavy industries that have, since the Second World War, been very active in this part of San Francisco. And it is an area that for decades has been what you might call a sort of classic environmental justice neighborhood within San Francisco. I use this particular picture, though, to show how close the very dense downtown area of San Francisco is to Bayview Hunters Point. And that's a very important context here to keep in mind. Some of you may be aware there's a recent very good movie called The Last Black Man in San Francisco, and Bayview Hunters Point plays the backdrop for that movie. The neighborhood where they grew up, where the main characters grew up, is Bayview Hunters Point. And these are scenes from that movie, and you're looking at Bayview Hunters Point behind you. You're looking at some of the cleanup that's happening. One very essential part of the context of Bayview Hunters Point is that you're seeing a picture here of the old Navy shipyards to give you a sense of the kinds of things that happened here. Those things have since shut down, and cleanup has been active for a couple of decades now. But also you have the first new transit line built in the city in 50 years coming to Bayview Hunters Point from the downtown area. It actually ends in this neighborhood, and you can see it's the T line on the 3rd Street line. It's a light rail line that makes its way through along the eastern waterfront of San Francisco. And you're looking at a map here, basically, of the eastern waterfront of San Francisco, which and the 3rd Street T line is shown on the map, as well as a number of other very, very large new greening interventions that are coming to Bayview Hunters Point. Essentially, a lot of these old industrial lands are being converted into new nature preserves and or parks, as well as along a greenway called the Blue Greenway along the waterfront. And essentially, the eastern waterfront, starting at downtown, is the kind of the current tidal wave of gentrification in the city of San Francisco. So it's just making its way down from downtown through Mission Bay, through Dogpatch, toward Bayview Hunters Point. And so there's a great deal of gentrification pressure being felt in the neighborhood, though it is very much in a pre-gentrification state right now. It's also very important to mention here that Bayview Hunters Point is considered by most people to be the last neighborhood in San Francisco with a remaining historic concentration of Black population. There used to be Black neighborhoods throughout San Francisco, but recent decades of rapid gentrification and demographic change has radically altered that. And Bayview is one of the last areas where there is a concentrated Black population in the city. And the key point for this case that I wanted to highlight is that basically what's happening in Bayview Hunters Point is something that we're seeing in a lot of cities, and it's one of the key tensions between social justice and greening in cities. And that it's reflected in this quote. And this is a quote from one of the longtime residents of Bayview Hunters Point. And it says, "Everyone is trying to stabilize housing. If you don't have a place to stay, you don't care that the sea level is going to rise, you don't care that your air is bad, you don't care about the quality of the environment." And this is from a resident who have been fighting for environmental cleanup for decades. And she's seeing that really these immediate threats of housing and gentrification are displacing concern over that threat. So residents are forced to make this trade-off. And just to leave this case, there's a greening group that's very active citywide. And essentially, as this quote says, they've had trouble implementing new green interventions in Bayview Hunters Point particularly, because of resident resistance to new green measures, because basically they see it as linked to gentrification processes and have social justice concerns about it. So it's this very fraught tension between gentrification and greening in these cleaned up neighborhoods, formerly industrial neighborhoods that are going through cleanup, that Bayview Hunters Point really exposes as an issue. And with that, I'll hand it off back to Isabelle to discuss one other case, and then we'll close it out.
Thank you, James. So we didn't want to have a presentation that did not include any European case. So I sadly put away my DC slides, which I care a lot about, to just include a few slides from Dublin. So Dublin belongs to part 4, which is about the complex entanglement of greening and multiple other gentrification pressures. And what we like a lot about Dublin, and here I want to acknowledge the work of my colleague Panagiota Kotsila, who I shared fieldwork with, is that Dublin represents a case of both very difficult, little by little greening in a context of a fast-growing city that is embedded into tourism-driven, but also student accommodation-driven gentrification. And that's something quite unique that we are increasingly seeing now, and why student accommodations are one of the new venues for capital accumulation in cities is something that I'd like to talk a little bit about in the latter part of Dublin. Next. So the Liberties is one neighborhood in the center of Dublin in a district called District 8. It's an industrial neighborhood, but not at all in the sense that Bayview Hunters Point is. It is a neighborhood that had a lot of small factories associated with Irish traditions and a lot of worker housing built around those factories. A lot of social housing, very poorly maintained, very poorly invested in over the years. Next. And at the same time, the district in Ireland with the lowest proportion of greening in a neighborhood. And so what we see in Dublin is that the Liberties face two concurrent historic crises: how to green and how to improve housing, and nowadays housing affordability for working class residents. To give you an idea of these deep social inequalities related to housing prices, in Dublin in 2018, just in a year, in Dublin 8 in particular, home prices went up by 7%, which I know in many US cities do not mean as much as, let's say 7% might not seem as much as it is for us, but in the context of Dublin 8, it was very substantial. And at the same time, it's a city that has 30,000 units of vacant housing. So a really deep access to housing crisis at the same time as housing affordability. Next. To try to address this lack of greening, and just to give you an idea, everything in Dublin 8 feels gray. The walls, the streets, the weather. So there's a very deep sensation of being in a box, and residents talk about it in terms of their mental health. Like everything is gray, their future is gray, their streets are gray, and there is no hope. And so in 2015, the Dublin City Council released the Liberties Greening Strategy, which for them had social, economic, and moral aim for substantially greater green investment. And it was meant to be a series of new parks, new gardens, new green streets as well, and new biking infrastructure. Next. And the two main, let's say, features that best illustrate the greening strategy is the park that you can see on the next slide, which is Weaver Park. It's a park that was built upon the mobilization of many families, many working class families in the Liberties. And it's a really great center of recreation, rights of nature to nature and play for kids, and really strong neighborhood cohesion. Next. The other space that illustrates the greening strategy is Bridgefoot Street Park, which is still under construction, even though it's been decided and budgeted for the last 4 years. And it is also meant to be a large-scale new amenity that will also represent what is named the new Liberties. Next. However, this greening process, as visible as it is and as emblematically focused as it is on a few spaces, has also along it pushed away and eradicated community gardens. And so what we really try to show in this article is which types of greening are being favored and which ones are becoming illegitimate, if you will. Next. One of the main issues that we also highlight in relationship to how the greening strategy is being deployed is that it is legitimizing and helping to market high-end student housing. And what we talk about here is large real estate corporations like GSA, for example, which is a global student housing, luxury student housing group, which is building small units, luxury small units of housing within large skyscrapers all over global cities, including Dublin, Copenhagen, London, Barcelona, Sydney, etc. And so the greening strategy was really a way to legitimize how a neighborhood was changing and to legitimize this large-scale investment. The problem with this accommodation is that not only are they not reserved for residents themselves who deeply need this type of housing, or any type of housing for that matter, is that they are not easily convertible because they are benefiting from recent regulations that do not oblige them to have as much light, as many windows, as many balconies, and as much space as other amenities. And in that sense, they cannot be zoned as residential. And that's particularly important. And at the same time, global investors know that those neighborhoods, that those types of housing, do not require to abide by inclusionary zoning laws. And so in that sense, they do not have to include any affordable housing features. What's also particularly interesting in those massive developments that are also taking place all over the liberties is that this type of student housing is the first entry gate to new transnational tech-led development in the neighborhood, which has been illustrated in other parts of Dublin along the waterfront. And so you have these kind of different waves of capital investment that rebrand a neighborhood, that help to revitalize it in the ways of capital investment, of course, but are excluded the original working class residents. Next. So just to give you a quote from a public official fighting against those recent neighborhood changes, the greening strategy was to make it look like this is a good area for you to invest in. Build your student accommodation here because next door, you're going to get a park. You're going to get a nice tourist trial. We're going to clean up the mess, but nothing for the residents. Next. What we also see in Dublin and in the Liberties in particular is how greening is becoming gated and how greening is becoming financialized and financed by those real estate developers who manage to create a legitimacy for their project by saying that they will include public space in them. It's a little bit like Chapter 91 in Massachusetts, for those of you who are familiar with it. So they finance greening, but then they privatized it and then they gate it, which is the case of that student accommodation that you see here, which did not used to have a gate, and there was a nice park inside that was meant to be open for the public, and now it's gated. Next. Next. So just to conclude on Dublin and let's say this dichotomous greenish neighborhood that we see is how can we reconcile both, and how can the Dublin City Council move towards a more affordable, inclusive greening that also does not pave the way for this massive large-scale redevelopment that not only doesn't give housing to the residents that have been living in Dublin, but at the same time does not allow for more inclusive public spaces to be present in the neighborhood. And that's really, really difficult in the context in which Dublin is, which is a very deep history of organizing incapacity, if you will, in or around housing issues. Because of the identity, because of the religious identity and organizing and political manifestations of the Dublin identity over time, social issues have really just been the victim of those types of identity politics. And that is something that came in a lot of our interviews, and it was really interesting because unlike what you see in many of our American cities, you don't have a housing movement. You don't have a long legacy of community organizing in Dublin because everyone was organized around this political and religious identity for decades, which really did not give space to any other forms of organizing. And so how can we avoid the construction of this dichotomous greening neighborhood when you also do not have this deep housing organizing capacity? And the floor is yours, James, again.
Thank you. So in the name of time, we're just going to quickly sort of give a sense of how we close the book, and then we'll open it up for questions. There's a conclusion to the book called A New Tale for the Green City, and it's very much pointing toward our intention to in fact, encourage people to write this new tale for the Green City in terms of social justice nexus. And essentially, just to state the kind of key takeaway for us It's that unless greening is linked to a conscious push, a conscious effort to push toward green justice via what we call an anti-subordination, intersectional, and relational mode of urban greening, unless that which is required happens, then you're going to have these kind of continued links between greening and social injustice, given the development context of cities today. And so we try to spell out what this conscious push toward green justice looks like in the conclusion. And we also offer, just to give you a notion of this, a whole chapter on what are some of the policy and planning pathways toward green justice, just to give a very concrete set of steps that cities and people who are interested in thinking about this can take in order to push toward equitable green development in cities. And we base these steps on what kind of policy tools we see cities starting to experiment with and we see starting to emerge within the cities we've looked at. So there's a book called Policy and Planning Tools for Urban Green Justice that you can download for free from from the Barcelona Lab for Urban Environmental Justice website. And it lists all of these tools, but there's also a chapter in this book that kind of summarizes some of them. And I won't go through this, but just to give you a sense, there are these kinds of ways that the tools are broken down and how we can kind of mobilize them toward green justice. We think that some of these tools can help us move toward addressing some of the deep conceptual issues that Isabelle raised in the beginning of the talk, and that our cases help to expose in a really concrete fashion. And then I just wanted to also mention quickly that we have a video called The Green Divide, a movie, actually, I should say, an online documentary called The Green Divide that uses the video format to dig into some of these same issues in some of the cities that we've also looked at. And with that, we would like to turn it over to questions. Thank you.
Thank you, James. Thank you, Isabelle. Can we stop the screen share?
Oh, sorry, yes.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you, James. Okay, wonderful presentation. My internet dropped for some reason, and so I've got the questions. Perry sent me them, but they do not have who asked the question. But I'm going to start. Really interested in Bayview Hunter's Point. The community didn't want greening. Did they, like the people of Brooklyn, articulate a kind of just green enough message?
It's interesting. I wouldn't say that I found much sort of clear articulation of a just green enough sentiment out. What I would say is I found a lot of frustration amongst people who have been pushing for greening for quite a long time in Bayview Hunters Point, and essentially not getting it. It was falling on deaf ears in the city by their description. And then their perception is that it's finally coming in a format that is very much formatted for kind of large scale development to be enabled in their neighborhood, and that to them is extremely frustrating. So I would say that their response isn't some sort of nuanced greening is going to work here, because they basically say it's done. Like it's all now shifted toward this kind of greening as a mode of gentrifying the neighborhood. And so really everything that comes there, and the greening that I was talking about in the quote was particularly just street trees. It was just street trees in the neighborhood. So very small scale greening initiatives. But there was very much high suspicion for those. And it's for good reasons, because of the circumstance that's been created in the neighborhood over several decades as a result of the kind of shifts that have happened in San Francisco.
Thanks, James. A question, and I can remember this is from Ben Davey, but this is the only one I can remember. Hi, Jim. Hi, Isabelle. I admire your effort, but I'm missing the overarching theory in a post-colonial, postmodern sense of greening and social justice. What's your response to that?
The postmodern way, I think that we haven't deeply theorized it in the book. What we have much more given a lens to is to the racialized landscapes, and how can we address a deep legacy of both segregation, unequal access to green space, urban renewal, and now greening. So these kind of, waves of urban development that have created the racialized gentrifying landscape that we now see in green cities, and where greening is basically not addressing those deeper issues. And so, for example, in the case of Washington, D.C. that I didn't present today, the 11th Street Bridge Park project aims in some ways at repairing the trauma of urban renewal, at tying together neighborhoods across the river that have different racial composition. It goes back to also giving land in some ways back to communities of color through this community land trust. But it doesn't, in some ways, and that's where I think our theory comes in, it doesn't have a deep decolonial and emancipatory lens because it is still embedded within the neoliberal practice of urban green financing, urban green growth in the city. And they are so, and the ways of investment that the bridge is paving and the types of interests that are now embedded in the project, like tax incremental financing zones, for example, those really show you how greening, if it is executed to the large scale as it is now and doesn't deeply go back to questions of reparations in particular, and access both to nature and to land for all, is not going to be able to move away from this racial capitalism that I think the case illustrates. So that's maybe one answer.
Great, thank you.
If I could just, sorry, Julian.
No, carry on, James.
I just wanted to add a quick bookend to that, which is to say thank you for the question. I think it's an important one for this topic. And something that I find to be very theoretically rich to think about in the context of this particular book is that there is a very strong link in most of our North American cases to kind of the green grabbing logic links up with this sort of settler colonial view of the use of greening within cities. And comparing that kind of settler colonial view within North America with the European context of urbanization is theoretically a rich kind of area for exploration. And the book, I think, starts to surface some of that, but there's a lot of questions I think one could answer or ask, about this issue.
Great, thanks to you both. What recommendations would you make for a city that seeks to embark on a greening agenda without engendering green-driven gentrification?
You want to start that, Isabelle?
I mean, sure. I think that the tools that our colleagues in the final policy chapters present, like the 30 anti-gentrification and inclusive greening tools, I think start giving you some answers about what is being done across the board. And, one of our messages was that housing should precede greening, housing rights should be very deeply embedded into greening, which I guess is not a surprise. But what we're trying to say is that this is also not enough because of the social cultural displacement that also exists with the way greening is taking place. So if you don't have this association of anti-displacement and inclusive greening and racialized priorities given to greening practices, then this green justice cannot be achieved. I also think there is this deep recognition that not everyone is Vienna, for example. Not every city has this deep history of socialist planning where housing rights and affordability remain at the center of city priorities across decades. Not every city is Nantes in France, which has inclusionary zoning at 56%. So imagine for every 100 units, you have 56 units that are protected for residents. So large-scale redevelopment is not going to take over those rights. And that's being implemented. That's not being bought up by developers on the side afterwards. So that's also this deep history that not every solution will work everywhere.
Yeah, and just to kind of pick up on that, the point of the policy, the key point of the policy chapter is that each city has a kind of mix of tools, and we try to lay out all the tools and say, okay, you have to find the right mix that works in your city. And just to state another way, what cities can do here, if you let greening do what greening does, then you're probably going to end up in problems. If you let greening do what greening does in the current context of urban development, you're probably going to end up with problems. And that's why the push toward consciously shifting greening toward a different direction is, I think, the key takeaway here.
Thank you. With the exception of Cleveland, your case studies focus on large metropolitan areas. Have you seen the green gentrification phenomenon in mid-sized cities?
I think we name the cities that we have focused on mid-sized cities, to tell you the truth. So it's mostly cities between 500,000 residents and 1.5 million. So in some ways, those are mid-sized cities. We know we do not have the major metro areas like UCLA, LA, New York, or Houston, for example, in the US. Whether that happens in small cities, yes, certainly so. We see that in Europe as well, in cities like Leipzig, for example, in Germany, which were never on the map of anyone even 15 years ago. And now you have this wave of greening and gentrification that affect the city, and then they move kind of through a region, right? So DC is being gentrified by Boston, which itself was maybe gentrified by New York. And so you have these flows of greening and gentrification that reproduce themselves, and that in a way move the greening frontier forward and mean that no city is exempt.
And the book does include cities like Cleveland and Baltimore and Nantes and Bristol, and these are, not the largest metropolises. They're much more identified as mid-sized cities, I would say.
Thanks. Very specific question here. Can you talk about what Portland, Oregon has done to reduce green gentrification?
My colleague Margarita Triguero Mas, I think, is in the audience too. So Margarita, feel free to jump in. She led the field work in Portland. The neighborhood that we studied in Portland was Scully. And what I think was very powerful in Curie was the ability to focus on green resilience planning in the context of climate impacts and do it via business models that really empowered some racialized communities, the Latinx community in particular, via co-op, via minority-led businesses, along, if you will, the whole planning, design, and execution process of greening. And so in that sense, you create a whole movement of investment in greening from within. You also change the entire investment towards, let's say, from outside towards the inside practice, which is often the case in the communities that you see. And you have also a strong political organizing around it and voice that is being raised along the way. Just to simplify and quickly summarize Portland. And Portland is also super interesting. Sorry, I meant to say that. It's not necessarily in the context of what we studied, but what we also found along the way, which is the right to return policy and right to return agenda that does not maybe yet affect Curly, but it affects Albina, for example, where residents displaced by urban renewal are now able to claim the right to come back.
Great, thanks for that. We have a question from Joyce Klemperer in New York. I'm curious about the level of awareness and commitment to racial and economic justice in government agencies responsible for planning and overseeing development. She says, also wondering about the influence of the real estate development sector in general, because in New York, developers essentially own the city, regardless of who's in office.
James, maybe go ahead.
Those are, I think, astute observations. Yeah, I mean, I think maybe if you think about the first section of the book, the kind of glitzy green urbanism section of the book, that very much is about the linking large-scale greening with increased development value, increased value of properties. That trend comes up in different ways throughout the book in different sections, but that's especially this kind of high-profile section of urban greening and green gentrification is this link. I would say we talked to public sector agency representatives in all of the cities we went to, and I would say there's increasing awareness of the kind of racialized impacts and the ways that cultural norms get reshuffled within the greening conversation, especially when development interests or financial impacts are considered. There's increasing awareness, but I think a lot of, in our experience, a lot of public sector agency staff are still trying to get their head around what it means and what cities can actually do in this conversation relative when they're speaking to developers about what to do here. I think that's still a very much an emerging conversation.
Great, thanks. All the examples you gave on the recreation of unjust racialized landscapes were American. Is this also a phenomenon seen in European cities like London and Paris?
So we didn't study London and Paris, but the answer is still yes, from at least what other researchers have shown. What we can give you examples of are places like Amsterdam, where my colleague Carmen Perez del Pulgar did some research in Amsterdam North, for example, and the park called Northwest Park, interestingly enough, is very much embedded into the post-industrial waterfront redevelopment of Amsterdam North. And what she found is that this part is very little used by Muslim minorities who live in the vicinity of the park. It's very much benefiting the leisure practices of long-term working class residents, but new residents are not only not feeling that the place isn't for them, but more in general within now the new neoliberal regime of governance, integration, and development in the Netherlands, minorities really very much have the finger pointed at them. If they are poor, if they are still not integrated within public space. And so you have now this sensation that Amsterdam is moving, as Susan Feinstein very much shows, from being the just green city as a historic example to being dismantled for what also our colleague Carmen calls the constant mobility. You have to be constantly mobile, economically mobile, socially mobile. You have to agree to change neighborhoods. And so these immigrants who are not part of this practice that the government is promoting, then definitely do not have a space in the city and not in the green spaces that are being created either.
Okay, has your research found examples of cities that have found that balance between greening and spatial justice?
I would hesitate. I don't know if Isabelle, I'm curious to hear if Isabelle has a different take on this, but I would hesitate to say that there's sort of like an ideal model out there right now, that there's a city that has figured this out, because they're very much, and for good reason, it's a complicated set of issues that's not strictly just confined to the greening question. It has to do with, very large dynamics in urban development. So, but I would say that a lot of cities are struggling to figure it out. A lot of cities are working on it from different sectors and from different angles. And the last section of cities, we definitely have cities that have projects going on that are designed to take this conscious green justice approach. And I would say that we do see that. And the cities in the last section of the book are examples, but there are others out there as well, of cities that have projects going on to try to build this, to try to make this happen. But I don't know if Isabelle, do you think there's an ideal model out there?
Always a risky thought, right? Yeah, I mean, the cities like that always come back to our minds. From an outcome standpoint, Vienna and Nantes are the very interesting one. And actually Nantes is a gentrifying neighborhood, but it is still, because of these inclusionary zoning and these large scale state-led redevelopment of industrial landscapes, able to maintain a wide income diversity in those green neighborhoods. And it's also working towards equality in greening, not only equity in greening. And so because of the parameter it chooses to have green space within 300 meters of every resident's home, to be a city with 100 parks and gardens, like you have this really deep and transversal green and blue agenda that also allows you to have always access to a form of green space, which is super interesting. Vienna also has this legacy I was talking about earlier. A city that I think we all care very much about, which is ours, Barcelona, very much with the current municipality and the mayorship of Ada Colau, has put greening of many, many different ways. Because if you come to Barcelona, I know many people love it, and it's a great place for our landscapes and architecture, but it is not a green city. And so the city is just fighting to just tear up the concrete everywhere it can and bring it small scale green spaces and do it in working class neighborhoods in particular. Yes, there's green gentrification, but the mission of it to create the green and inclusive city is very much at the center of Ada Colau's agenda.
Okay, we've got so many questions and I'm not going to get through all of them, but I think this is a really excellent one. Do you think rehab programs to weatherize homes or lower energy costs in existing neighborhoods of color and or low income will drive gentrification?
I mean, we haven't studied that, but Stefan Buzarovsky's work, he is a researcher in Manchester in the UK. is about energy gentrification. And so he shows that even those programs are linked to gentrification. There are a few articles out there on this. James, do you know of others?
I would just say there is evidence of this out there, and it links to a kind of a bigger question that is about, does this extend beyond green spaces into sort of the wider notion of greening cities and these initiatives that do green cities? And one of the people in our labs, Galia Chakri, has worked a bit on this relative to green infrastructure related to water management. And there is evidence that it kind of becomes linked up with larger cultural processes in the city, even if it's a less tangible greening initiative like energy efficiency.
Okay, well, we are out of time. Fantastic work, Isabelle. I think the book is coming out November 30th. Is that right?
I think so.
Yeah, that's right.
The great thing
giving present, everyone.
The thing about being a series editor is that I get a free copy. But you know what? I'm going to get one for my department, UEP, because I just think this is, this brings together so many of the issues we are passionate about in urban planning. Can we give an enormous thank you to James, to Isabelle, to the Barcelona Center for Urban Environmental Justice. Go download their reports, the toolkits. They are a force to be reckoned with. And thanks for all the work that you do. Thank you very much. Next week, November 17th, we have Kian Go presenting her work on urban resilience to climate justice. See you soon, people. Thank you.